Hello there, it's Zoe. Welcome back to the show. Our theme this week is leading and working backwards. My question for you this week is, do you love your work? Is it broken? And can we fix it? Let's find out. On Planet Human this week, DARPA. Have you heard of DARPA? I hadn't. It is the U.S. Defense of Advanced Research Projects Agency. Sounds like they put a lot of vowels in there to make it a good acronym. But in any case, DARPA wants to design and build large objects in space. They want to have big infrastructure in space. So space manufacturing is a thing. And we're talking like infrastructure that is 500 meters long. So real sci-fi stuff. Now, the even more sci-fi stuff is that they are experimenting with synthetic biology as part of creating these infrastructures so that you can grow these structures in space. Very cool. It reminds me of some of my sci-fi movies that I've been watching where the alien spaceship looks like internal organs as you wander through the corridors. Could be something like that, or maybe not. But that is the future. And the future is also about space manufacturing. So there are new technologies emerging as we ride the wave of more space exploration into the future. That's Planet Human. On Planet Zoe, this week I set off on a 2-week adventure on the Australian Alpine walking track. This is the second year in a row I'm heading out with some friends, my ex-Outward Bound friends, my girlfriends, and we are having 2 weeks of trudging up and down hills. And I've been training a lot for this over the last 8 or 9 weeks. I've been up at 6 a.m. with my packed full of water bottles to give it some weight, and up and down hills, trying to get my body ready for the onslaught that it will be. We're expecting to do 6,000 meters in elevation over the 2 weeks, which is, almost all the way up Mount Everest. So it's a lot. And I've been carrying an injury since last year's trek on my Achilles, and it hasn't been fixing itself despite all the interventions with orthotics and physiologists and physiotherapists. Yeah, I still have a problematic Achilles, but it hasn't stopped me walking, and I'm really looking forward to that. The other thing that's happening on Planet Zoe is Power Games. Woohoo! I have been working on the game side of the Power Game. So when we launch on Kickstarter on May 19th, one of the components that you might be able to buy, and there'll only be like 3 of them available, is to pilot test run the Power Play game that is based on the book Power Games. And it'll be a really neat thing to do with your teams, where we explore the shadow side of archetypes and how those power plays how they happen in real time around a particular topic. So hopefully it'll give you an insight into mapping your own power as well as power dynamics in a team. So that is all happening, and you can sign up for the Kickstarter page fairly shortly. The link is in the show notes. If I don't get that sorted before I go on the walk, which I intend to do, you can always get more information on my website at zoerath.com. The other piece of news on Planet Zoe is that I have started a Substack. What is a Substack, you may be asking? It is a newsletter platform. Originally, it was designed to help writers engage directly with their audience while also making money from their writing. The idea is that writers could publish long form, short form, nonfiction or fiction, and invite their audience to support them as sponsors. That's sort of the starting point from it. It's kind of expanded quite a lot from there. There's great topics on there. I basically go there for a lot of my news. So there's a lot of political commentary that I follow from independent journalists who have left the big media enterprises like Washington Post and set up their own shop because they're so disgruntled with what's happening with the mainstream media. So there's media, there's stuff on fiction, there's lots of nonfiction. It's a really interesting community, and it's devoid so far of the toxic crap that you find on some of the other social media sites. So I am migrating all of my content there. You're still getting publications like this through YouTube and on the audio podcast platforms and on my website. I just want to consolidate it and have it all in one place so people can dip in and out in a very convenient platform. So that is Substack. The link will be in the show notes. What if, and how might we? What if we created life and work on our own terms How might we do that? It's the topic of the conversation for today with my guest, who I'll introduce shortly. I think the first thing we need to realize is that our systems, our work systems, are built from our values and beliefs. So if we're going to change how we do work, the system of work, we actually need to change our values and beliefs first. And the way to get to do that is, I think we need to interrogate a few things for ourselves. The first one is, how do we define success? Because how we define success then drives us to take particular actions when it comes to work and how we earn money to make a living. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what is a life well lived? And my guest invites us to consider that. And I don't think we considered that well enough. We do have choice in how we construct our lives, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like that. Sometimes it feels like we're channeled and railroaded down a particular path. So how can we construct a life that is well lived? That's the second thing to determine. And the third one, which I've talked about before on the show, is defining how much is enough. Is it always about more and more and more? Or is there a place where we can get to where we go, that's enough? Enough money, enough resources, enough socializing, enough travel. I don't know, but there is probably a stage where we can go, that's enough of an experience for me. I'm going to savor that. And that leads out of the idea of what is a life well lived. So 3 questions for you to consider if you're looking at living life on your own terms is, what is success? What is a life well lived? And how much is enough? I'm having chai today in tea time in the office kitchen. And my guest today is Tim Duggan. And he's an Aussie who's been living abroad and making his way back to the country. At least he was when we jumped into this interview. He is a very interesting fellow. He's a co-founder of several digital media enterprises or ventures, notably Junkie Media, which he grew from a startup into a large enterprise and sold it off, and now has been writing and speaking and diving into topics that take him by the interest, take him by the horns, and where he shows interest. I think that's an analogy that's working. He writes a weekly column now for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And he has 3 books out. There's his first one, Cult Status, which I've read, won the Best Enterprise and Small Business Book at the Australian Business Book Awards in 2021. And his latest book is Work Backwards, and the topic of today. So without further ado, here is Tim Duggan. Well, all the way from a hotel room in Bangkok. Welcome to the show, Tim Duggan.
Thank you for having me, Zoe. I'm very happy to be here.
Let me just actually check that I pronounced your name properly, because I didn't check with you before we started recording.
Tim Duggan. Yes, you got it exactly correct.
God. Okay, good. There you go. Sometimes you never know. And what I am excited to talk to you first about is that you've led an extraordinary life. You were telling me a little bit about it before we got on the show, having started off your first business at the very young, tender age of 23. And now you are global roaming. So can you tell me how you got to where you are now, which led to I'm guessing, the inspiration behind your book, Work Backwards, from where you started to where you are now?
It's one of those things that always sounds like it's a straight line when you retell it, and you realize how much it is not. But I'll tell you the straight line version, because that's all we have time for. And the straight line version is, I was originally a music journalist and really interested in the intersection between journalism and writing and music. And in my early 20s, I started writing for Rolling Stone magazine after seeing the movie Almost Famous. And it was something that really I kind of discovered how much I enjoyed crafting words and putting things together. Then when I was in my early 20s, some friends of mine had started a website. This is going to show my age here. This was in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s.
Oh, long ago.
It was so long ago when the internet was a very different place. It was before the oligarchs had destroyed the internet and had taken it over as their playground, before Facebook, before Twitter, before X, before YouTube and Google. And the internet was this really fresh place where people met each other, and it was about community and it was about discovery. And some friends of mine had started a website for people who were into electronic dance music to come and meet and connect with each other. And I had recently come out as gay a couple of years earlier. And I was sitting down with one of them and we said, does anything like this exist for the gay community? And I was like, no, it doesn't. And so we decided to start it. And that was one of those decisions that you make as a 23, 24-year-old without much thinking. Just, you say yes to something. And then over the next 15 years, that company grew and morphed, and we had good times and very hard times, and turned into a media company called Junkie Media, Junkie. And it was and still exists as a media company for young Australians. And we grew this business into about 60 full-time staff at its peak. So it was a good small to medium-sized business. It rode the ups and downs of the internet, of digital media in Australia. And then in 2016, we sold the company to a large ASX listed company. I had an earnout and hung around for a couple of years. And then in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, just as things were heating up, I left there. And that was a really fascinating time because I just published my first book that same year called Cult Status, which was all about how to build a really strong community around
Great book.
business. Thank you very much. It was a really interesting experience writing my first book where I knew nothing about how to do it. And then what really happened around that period, though, was three major things happened that made me come to write this current book that we're talking about today, Work Backwards, which was one, I left my job after 15 years and I had a bit of an identity crisis. I didn't really know who I was once I took that armor of my job title away from me because I'd built my entire identity around my work. And that really threw me for six. I wasn't expecting that. So that happened. The second thing that happened was COVID, which obviously happened to everyone, where all of our lives were completely upended and we had to figure out what was going on. And then the third thing that happened was my father, who was one of the greatest influences on me and the person who I most looked up to, passed away. And those three things all happened and they all hit me at the same time. And when you sit down to write the eulogy for your father for his funeral, talk about the legacy that he had, you can't help but have this part of your brain that says, what are they going to say at your funeral? What is your legacy? What are you doing? And that made me really just reconsider the way that we're working, the way that we're living, the way that I'm personally working and living. And that sent me down this rabbit hole to explore work and the way that we're living.
And you emerged from the rabbit hole having published Working Backwards.
I did. Yes, it took a few years. I worked very closely with my publisher because every time I tried to really take hold of this very big topic about work, I spent a few years researching, traveling the world, speaking to experts, thinking, writing, rewriting, and eventually came to a conclusion, which is hard for me as a self-described optimist, was that the way that we're working is broken. And therefore, as an optimist, my challenge was, well, how can we fix it? And that was what Work Backwards, that's what Work Backwards is all about.
Okay, well, let's talk about the brokenness pieces first, because there's a couple things that you mentioned in some of your materials that I was like, what is that? So coffee badging was one of them. I'm like, what the hell is this? I feel sometimes I'm so behind the times. And conscious unbossing. And what's going on here?
There's a lot of trends, a lot of work trends at the moment. I write a weekly column for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age at the moment on work and careers. And there is every week there is something to write about. And two of these trends that really illustrate some of the ways that the way that we're working is broken and the way that we're thinking about work is conscious unbossing, which is where there's an entire generation coming through the workforce now, which is Gen Z, which is roughly 18 to roughly late 20s, let's say kind of most of them in their 20s. And their approach to work is very different to their older siblings, to their parents, to their grandparents. And it often can be seen, and they're often labeled as lazy, or they don't care about work, or they're entitled. And it's actually, I think all of that is wrong. I think that they actually have this really great relationship with work, which is that they have realized and looked at the statistics that I looked at around people burning out and around disengagement in the workforce and all these things going up, and said, I don't want that.
Mm.
And so conscious unbossing is this trend where this new generation coming through actually saying, I don't want to be the boss. I don't want to be in middle management. And there were some statistics that came out last year that around half of Generation Z and workforce said that they didn't want to be managers. They were
Wow.
happy just to do the work and not take on the what they saw as boring and hard and complicated parts of management. So it's a really interesting trend.
That is a really interesting trend. It'll be interesting to see if it actually plays out as they progress in their lives, and whether they get new priorities when they start to, if they do start to marry, have children, because all of a sudden your priorities can tend to shift when you have those kinds of responsibilities, whether they might gain a sense of interest in becoming a manager and therefore get the salary package that goes with it. It's interesting too, because the same things were said of Gen Y when Gen Y came into the workforce. Not that they were lazy and not wanting to be going for managers, but the entitlement piece. But it was entitlement from a different thing. It was Gen Y, I think I should be the boss tomorrow. So it's kind of got a different flavor to it.
Yeah, it does. And Gen Y, of which I call myself the world's oldest living millennial, and I will happily live that crown until I die. Um, the Gen Y or millennials had a quite a different view of work, which was there was a sense of I want to work hard, I want to hustle, the whole entire hustle culture, the
Mm,
entire girl
mm,
bossing culture was I want to come in and I want to take control and I think I know what's right.
yeah.
And that is, there was an element of entitlement to that. There was an element of acting ahead of yourself. But it also was a sign that millennials were really in a rush to try and get to the top.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is quite different from the current generation, where they're happy to stay at the bottom because they actually see that a life work balance is really important and they don't want to burn out like their parents have.
Yeah. Hmm. And so how does this relate to, or coffee badging? Is that part of this whole attitude?
And a coffee badging it is related in a way, and coffee badging is really a symptom of tension that we see in the workplace. And there's a lot of tension at the moment in the workplace between employers and employees. The
Mhm.
biggest flashpoint of that tension is probably the working from home versus return to the office debate, which
Mhm.
is just an ongoing quagmire of complications, is a nice way of putting that. And coffee badging is a trend that one trend report that I read last year by Owl Labs showed that around 50% of people said that they had coffee badged in the past year. And what that means is people who generally work from home are being told you have to come into the office 2 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever the requirement is. And
Mhm.
coffee badging means that some of them are coming into the office, they are swiping their badge. So you go in there, you swipe your badge, you say, I'm here, and then they go out for coffee before returning home. So it's about
Really?
yeah, it's about doing the bare and minimum required to tick the box of what the corporation says, but nothing more. And it is a really interesting trend because it kind of shows this, as I said, flashpoint of tension between employers and employees around the rules of engagement, around how and why we should work.
Yeah. And also demonstrating it, if you're going to gather in a location, it's got to be purposeful. So just requiring people to have their body present doesn't necessarily make it purposeful. There's some arguments with the return to office mandates, thinking that naturally creativity and connection and collaboration will be enhanced by proximity, but maybe not if people are that disdainful of the whole premise. And it also speaks volumes to the management. If people are coffee benching and nobody's noticing, like those managers should be pulled up for not even caring, really.
I think all of these are kind of systematic of a lack of trust and a lack of transparency in a workplace. And you would like to think that good managers and good leaders would be able to identify this before it becomes a problem, would be able to address it if it does become an issue with their team, and would be able to look at some of the reasons why. As you mentioned, if someone in your team is, or you suspect them of doing a version of coffee badging, just coming to the office for the bare minimum before leaving, I think you really need to question, well, why? Is it because the work they want to do is not aligned with the environment they're in? Is it because they're not engaged as a member of the staff? There's lots of, I think, real clues and ability to investigate beyond some of these headline trends.
Yeah, got it. So Tim, let's talk about your solution. So there's lots of things we could moan about in terms of the workplaces, and this whole dilemma between work from home and work in the office is one of them. What's your solution? You wrote Work Backwards. Presumably you've got some principles that you'd like to put out there. What are they?
I do have a solution. It is not the solution. And it's quite interesting to think through this, because unfortunately I haven't fixed work with one book. I haven't solved
aim higher.
The entire systematic problems of inequality. Unfortunately, not going to be solved with this book. But the one thing that we do have control over is how we as individuals think about work, how we approach work, how we approach our own mindset to work and the own way that we work. And the simple way that the framework that I look at it is that the way we're working is broken, and the output of that is we essentially are a relatively disengaged workforce. We are a relatively overworked workforce, and we're a relatively apprehensive workforce. All these stats have just been going in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the way that we think about work is, in my view, in the wrong direction. So we tend to think of work first. That's the first thing that we think of, the job that we're doing, the job that we get. Work is kind of like generally the primary way that we view most of this. Then we think, what money can work give us? And we usually have not much say of what that money is. Our employer decides that. And the final part of that is life. So you have work, then money, then life. And life is what we can do with the resources that we're given, the time that we're given. How can we live a life that is able under those circumstances? And the simple premise behind Work Backwards and the way to fix it is to rethink that. And instead of thinking work, then money, then life, turn it around, and we need to think life first, then money, then work. And what I mean by that is life first is figuring out, what is it that we actually like doing? Where do we get meaning from? And a simple way of doing that is an acronym that I call MAP, which stands for meaning, anchors, and priorities, which are the three things that you need to really understand in life. Then money, figure out how much money you actually need to live.
Can I interrupt you before we get into the money piece, just to clarify what you mean by anchors?
Yeah, so anchors is my term for core values.
Okay.
And the reason that I call them anchors is because I feel that values has been kind of taken over by work. So if you ask somebody, most people would know what their work values were. I think most organizations have done a very good job over the last 10 to 15 years of establishing work values, of ensuring people know what they are. There's obviously good and bad examples of that, but I feel like values as a term is kind of been consumed by work. And what I think about the MAP side of it, so meaning, anchors, and priorities. The meaning is knowing what meaning you get from work as well as outside work. The A of anchors is knowing what your core values are. So what are the 4 or 5 parts of you that make up you, that make you unique? And the P is priorities. So really understanding out of all the things that you could be spending your time on, what do you actually want to be spending your time on, and where should you be spending your time, and being more intentional about it as opposed to just automatically defaulting to work.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. And so the next things to work on.
The life part is so
Life part. Yep.
and that's having a map. The
Yep.
second part is the money section, which
Mhm.
is you can't talk about work without talking about money because it's the main reason that most of us work. Yet we generally don't, we think of it in the wrong direction. We think of, okay, this is my job and this is the money I'm going to get. Whereas if you work backwards and think of it the other way around, by designing what what type of life you want, what gives you meaning, what your priorities are, what your anchors are, you should then figure out, okay, how much money do I actually need in order to live that life? So let's forget about work. Let's think of it from, I want to spend more time with my kids. I want to prioritize my health. One of my core values is curiosity. So I want to spend more time reading or traveling, whatever that is, figuring out, and I've got a really simple process, got a backwards budget, which is figuring out from the bottom up how much money you need to live the life that you want to live. And sometimes that can be a really enlightening exercise because it can be less money than you think.
Mm.
And also sometimes can be more money than you think.
Mm.
And it's a completely personal thing. I'm not here to tell anyone how much money they think is enough for them. But this whole concept of really just trying to understand what enough is for you and your family and what you get value from, as opposed to just defaulting to trying to earn enough money to get that second car because your neighbor has that car, or get a bigger house because your family think you should get a bigger house, or whatever it is. It's about actually determining what enough is for you. And I think that's really important.
Mm. That whole idea of enough is such a useful frame. There's a big difference between more and enough. And I don't think people are conscious or deliberate, intentional enough about what is enough and what it means to go beyond that. Okay, cool.
I think it's one of the biggest questions that any of us can answer in our life. What is enough? Because if we don't answer it, we'll never get there. You'll never actually reach what enough is. I'll give you an example of enough for me, not in a money sense. Well, certainly in a money sense, my husband and I have figured out how much money we need to live a life that is really fulfilling to us. And that is the amount of work that we do each week. So we both currently work 3 days a week.
Yep.
We work Monday to Wednesday. And then from Thursday to Sunday, we travel the world. We go and do food tours. We jump on boats and planes and do whatever we can. We hike up mountains. We jump into camper vans. Whatever really fulfills us is what we do on the rest of the time. And then on Monday to Wednesday, we work really hard, really focused. And that brings in enough money for both of us to live the lifestyle that we want. For me also, on a business sense, when I was running my business, my concept of enough for me, and this was from a young age, was I always wanted to start a business and sell it. That was what I wanted. That was almost, for me, that was a recognition that I had created value in the world and that someone was willing to pay money for that value. And I treated that as a finish line for me. Instead of having this finish line of when I reach 65, I'm going to retire. For me, my finish line was I want to start a business. I want to work quite hard, and then I want to sell the business. And then when I get to that finish line, I'll stop and I will then reconsider what I want to do next. And that's exactly what happened. It took longer than I thought. It was harder than I thought. But when that process happened, I got to that finish line and I was able to stop and pause and take a breath. And that has enabled me to now move into this next stage of writing books and traveling and doing things that I really love because I realized what enough was for me at that time. Enough success.
And success, expand on that. How do you define success these days?
Yeah, success for me is happiness. That's my baseline that I try to solve for. And happiness for me and for my husband and my friends and my family around me. I try to ensure that I'm fulfilled and I'm creative and I have all these kind of different parts of my life relatively balanced. There's a really interesting part of the book which I call a full circle life. which is looking at all of the things that we could be doing with our time, and roughly falls into 4 buckets, which is work, mind, body, and relationships. So we could be spending time on any of those 4 things. And for me, happiness and enough is when those are balanced. So I'm spending enough time on work, but not too much, enough time on my body, which is not just exercising, but is also going for walks and cooking and shopping and thinking about it. Enough time on my mind, which is reading, or sometimes I combine that with the body side by going for hikes. And my husband and I sometimes go for a hike, for a 4-hour hike, and we won't speak for about 3 hours of it because we're both just in our own heads, just processing our thoughts. And then the last part is relationships. And that's something that as I travel the world and am away from most of my family and friends, I have to really consciously think about how can I dial up and how can I try to schedule in time to kind of keep those relationships alive. And that is happiness for me, if those 4 parts of my life are in alignment.
And I love how, in describing how you get to where you are right now, the work component piece is not just a means to an end either. It's still got interest and meaning for you. So tell me a little bit about your concept then of having worked backwards from your life to the dollars that you need to then work. It's not just, oh, and this is how I'm going to do it, just bolt on this slave job.
Yeah, so work then is obviously the part of the book and the part of our life that we need to really solve for. But the problem is most of us just go straight into that without thinking about what we're trying to solve for. So once you've figured out the life part, you've figured out how much money you need, it's then to look at either the work that you're doing or the work that you want to do and try to understand how you can use some of these extraordinary tools that we have available to us now in order to either make your current job work for you or find a job that will work for you. And so some of these tools, and the reason why I had to write this book now, is because we are living through this phenomenal once in a generation's moment. The last 5 years have caused the biggest change to how we work and how we live in generations. If you even think about all these conversations that we are having now in 2025, back to 5 years ago, almost to this day when COVID upended the way that we work, we are now having conversations around hybrid working. How many days should we work at home? Should we introduce a shorter working week? What about 4-day weeks? What about artificial intelligence? How is that changing our role? All of these things are all meeting and converging at the same time in history. And it's phenomenal because we finally have tools that we can use in order to claw back hours of the day, minutes of the day, days of the week. And when we do that, we should figure out, well, what should we do with that time? Should we just work more? Or should we try and solve for where we get meaning from, both at work and outside work?
Yeah, I love it. And what's been the response to your ideas around working backwards?
It's been a wonderful response. So the book was launched in April last year in Australia and has had a wonderful response there. I literally not a day goes past when I don't get an email from somebody who fills me in on either a small or a large way that they've changed their life after reading the book, which is just one of the best things to hear. And then in November last year, it launched internationally in the US and UK. And I've just come back last month from a book tour of the UK. And one of the most interesting parts of this is the universality of this experience of the way that work has changed. So I didn't matter if I was speaking to office workers in Milton Keynes or in Birmingham or in London, or a tour of Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra that I did last year. Everyone is grappling with some of these same issues. And all of us, I think, can see the hope and optimism that is there, that some of these tools like hybrid working and flexible working and 4-day work weeks have the potential to help us as a society work better. but there's still a lot of confusion and messiness and questions around how you actually implement these tools in day-to-day life. And that's the part where I think everyone's grappling with at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's more than just an individual's reimagining of their world. It's also, okay, the larger systemic issues and even cultural norms about what work means. What does it mean to be part of a team, part of a work environment? What are we prepared to accept and tolerate? And there's legal changes in the workforce as well, in terms of responsibilities of employers to provide workplaces that are psychosocially safe and redo how we manage workload. So there's also that push coming as well. But the idea that as individuals we can take stewardship for our own experience is still pretty essential. Now,
it
sorry,
really
Tim,
is. I'll just add one more thing, Zoe,
yeah.
which is the other thing that has surprised me is we're talking about leadership on this podcast, and I know that ranges from sole traders and people who don't have staff and work for themselves through to leaders in large organizations, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And one thing that's really heartened me about promoting work backwards so far and speaking to people of all different types of work is the number of large corporations who are acknowledging that the way that we're working is broken as well within their organizations. And I think that's been really wonderful to see. So I have gone to large multinational companies, so management consultant companies that have bought a copy of the book for all of their partners and leaders, through to large finance companies. I'm going to London to do a book club next month to speak to one of the largest finance companies in the world. And that, to me, when we're talking about, important topics, that we're talking about burnout, we're talking about things going wrong in the wrong direction, we're talking about overwork.
Yeah.
I've been heartened by the fact that some of these large companies are willing to and open to having these conversations and not just putting their head in the sand.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good thing to see.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what pans out, what kinds of changes, initiatives they take on to help make a systems change like that. Now, Tim, are you ready for the Fast Three?
I was born ready for the Fast Three.
Okay. All right. Number one, what is the future tech that you most want right now?
Teleportation. For me, I travel so much. I am constantly on planes. I'm constantly packing bags. I'm constantly shuffling through security lines. And I cannot wait for the day when I can physically teleport myself to another location without having to catch a plane.
Yeah. You say work is broken. I think travel is broken just by the number of people who wish for teleportation as a solution. All right. Number two, what is the best tip you ever got for leadership?
The best tip that I ever got was something I learnt the hard way and figured out, was given it from originally a book that I read, which was The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and then had to put it into practice. And the tip was, if you're going to eat shit, don't nibble on it. And essentially in leadership, there's lots of times when you have to make really hard decisions. You have to let people go. You have to have difficult conversations. And there's times when there's going to be a shit sandwich in front of you. And essentially, if you're going to eat shit, don't nibble on it. So don't just kind of go around the edges and do little small things. Dive headfirst into it and sometimes embrace it.
Okay. I love that. I've never heard that expression before. I'm going to embrace that one. All right. Yeah. Number three, hang on. What are you reading or listening to right now?
So I have been in Thailand for the last month on a bunch of small, beautiful islands as I work my way slowly back to Australia. And I've really been loving rereading books that I have read in the past. And the reason why I love rereading is because you pick up new things within the books. And some of them have been nonfiction and some of them are fiction. I like to kind of blend the two. So nonfiction, I reread Who Moved My Cheese?
Yeah.
The very iconic text that has sold 28 million copies around the world. A very simple fable about change and adaptation. I reread that recently because I'm just looking at different ways of the book's been written, and I wanted to reread that. That was interesting. And then I'm rereading a bunch of fiction books that I've read in the past. So Sally Rooney, Conversation with Friends, and The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window. Fiction books that help me switch off from work, but ironically, I probably end up thinking more when I read a fiction book than sometimes I do with a non-fiction book, because it just like tickles that part of my brain.
Yes, I think fiction is sneaky that way. It can stimulate new thinking in a way that sometimes a non-serious non-fiction book cannot. So I write both for that reason. I'm playing in the space of, what ideas can we spur through the fictional stories.
I love that. And I was just in a bookstore last night here in Bangkok, and I picked up The Let Them Theory by Mel Robbins, which I'm really looking forward to reading, because I understand the theory on the surface.
Yeah.
And I really want to kind of understand the theory underneath the surface.
Awesome. Well, Tim, that was the Fast 3.
Amazing. I love that.
Fantastic. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you'd love to share with the audience?
No, I suppose my final word on this is that the future of work is something that we're all dealing with right now. And it is three things. It is very personal. So my future of work is different to your future of work. It is very messy. We're all dealing with this at the same time. And it is here now. The future of work is here, and we're all dealing and grappling with it. And it's an exciting, thrilling, and daunting time.
Awesome. So where can people find out more about you and your books?
The simplest place is to just go to my webpage, which is www.timduggan.com.au. That's TIMDUGGAN.com.au.
Fantastic. Tim, thank you so much. This was so much fun. I really appreciate your insights and love hearing about your life and your work and what you're up to now. It's fabulous.
Thank you for having me, Zoe. I really enjoyed it.
On Read to Lead this week, it is Tim Duggan's very own book, Work Backwards. Work Backwards. Subtitle is The Revolutionary Method to Work Smarter and Live Better. So Tim expounds on some of the frameworks and concepts that we discussed on the show. He gives us really great examples, some food for thought, some aspirational stories to help us make sense of how we can actually take life by the horns and live and work better. So a lovely little revolutionary book by someone who actually drinks his own Kool-Aid and makes his own decisions based on his own premise. Well-researched, evidence-based, evidence-backed, proven strategies that he himself is living. So that's what we are recommending. Work Backwards by Tim Duggan. That's it for the show this week. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please rate and review the show. We don't have that many ratings or reviews on the show. And I know it's actually quite tricky sometimes. You have to stop whatever podcast app you're in, find the way to actually give a review and rating. For some reason, they don't make it easy. So I'm ever so grateful if you do manage to get in there and go, leave a couple of comments about it, or even just press the 5-star or whatever star that you think the show deserves. It's much appreciated. If you want to discuss something on the show or air your opinions, please send me an email or click on the Facebook link and get onto the Facebook page and drop in your mentions there, or any of the social platforms that we are on. It makes it more of a conversation. Or if you're savvy, go to Substack, where I will publish all these editions, and you can have a conversation with the other Substack readers there, which would be awesome sauce. If failing all of that, do become a podcast insider. You can sign up at zoerouth.com, click on podcast. And as a podcast insider, you get a dedicated email, which has additional resources, including discussion questions for you and your team, so you can put into practice the things that you've learned. You get a whole tip sheet on summarized from the conversation about how you can go ahead and implement. And then we've got these water cooler facts, which make you look very smart in discussions around the water cooler, because everybody has one of those, right, in their office. I don't even know. What else can you do? Well, those are the main things. And in the meantime, I think you should know about the next episode. And next coming up, we have Emma Rainsville, who is the wizard of ops. She is obsessed about operations and is an expert at taking big picture strategy and turning it into executable, I think that's the right word, operations, which can streamline efficiency and set you up for exponential growth. So that's next week on the show, Emma Rainsville. In the meantime, live with grace, lead in service, live well, lead well.